What's up, guys? Today I will be showing Toxic Gamer up, which is monetized gamer. If you guys haven't subscribed to him already, please do subscribe to him. But I will be showing him up in this video by saying MrBeast 1001 times. Okay, I have the counter up on the TV. Okay, so, well, better get going. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, MrBeats, MrBeats, Beast. I keep saying beats for some reason. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beats. Oh God, MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, MrBeats, Beast, MrBeast, MrBeats. I said beats, but whatever. Okay, let's do one. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beats, MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beats. Why do I keep saying beats? MrBeast, 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 MrBeats. I'm done saying beats. Okay. MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beast, MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beast, MrBeast, MrBeast, Beats, Beast. Okay, that's 100 times. Well, this is gonna be a long video. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 Mrs. Beast. I'm saying, MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beats, damn. MrBeast, 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 MrBeats, Beats. Oh my God, my voice, like, okay. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Oops, I didn't mean. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, MrBeast, Beats, I keep saying, bro. MrBeast, 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 Beats. I'm so dumb. I'm like actually retarded. So sorry about that. MrBeast, 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 Mr. P. I almost said Mr. P. I don't know. Guys, you try saying MrBeast 257 times really fast. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 Beats. I'm so stupid. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mrs. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I wish I could hang this somewhere. Like, hold on. Oh, can I hang it somewhere? And maybe right here? No. I'm just gonna have to hold it or something. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beats, Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats, Beats, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats. Why do I keep saying Beats? Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beats, Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. Give me like a 10-second break. 1. Okay. That's good. Mr. Beast, 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 Mr. Beast. I need my freaking Cheez-Its. Oh crap, I exited out of the thing. Okay, it's still there. Okay. Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast, Mr. Beast. Hold on. Mr. Beast, 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 MrBeast. Halfway there. Get some Cheez-Its real quick. Okay. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Crap. How's that keep happening? MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Let me get into a comfortable position. MrBeast, 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 oh, I got this thing again. Clap. Come. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Stuff my mouth with some cheese real quick. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, MrBeast. Oh, hold on, more cheese. MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Oh, what's that stupid string now? MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 and MrBeast. Hold on. Okay. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Hold on. MrBeast, MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, MrBeast, Beast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, MrBeast. Are you serious? MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast. Oh crap! I held down X for some reason. Let me go back down to like 25. Okay. MrBeast, 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 MrBeast. Hold on. Last set of cheeses, I swear. MrBeast, 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 Beast, 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 Beast. MrBeast, 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 Beast, Beast, MrBeast, 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 Beast, MrBeast, 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 no, MrBeast. Oh, MrBeast, 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 and MrBeast. Ah. Well, if you guys enjoyed that video, like and subscribe. And yeah, that was a hard one. A lot of tongue twisters. Made me want to die. So you should sub. So anyway, I'll see you in my next video, which is probably gonna be a Fortnite video. And bye.